That was Michael Anthony, okay? 100% dedicated, never did anything to hurt those guys, and they tried to hurt him again and again and again.
Michael Anthony spent nearly 3 decades holding down the low end of one of the loudest, most chaotic rock bands in American history. And for most of that time, he did it without complaint. He was the bassist fans rarely talked about first. The harmony voice that made Jump and Panama sound the way they did. The guy who showed up on time and did the job while the Van Halen brothers and David Lee Roth fought, feuded, and made headlines. But underneath that steady, professional exterior was a slow accumulation of grievances, a contract signed under pressure, credit quietly stripped away, public insults from a man he considered family, and finally, a phone call that never came when his own job disappeared. By the time Michael Anthony turned 70, he had spent years being asked about all of it in interviews, and piece by piece, he stopped staying quiet. To understand how deep that hurt ran, it helps to go back to where his music actually started. Anthony grew up in a household where music wasn't a hobby, it was simply present. His father played trumpet and performed regularly, and young Michael absorbed that world by osmosis, watching a parent treat an instrument as a serious, disciplined pursuit rather than a passing interest. He followed that example first, picking up trumpet himself and playing through school music programs after his family settled in Southern California in the 1960s. He marched in a school band, learned structure and timing, and built the kind of foundational discipline that doesn't show up on a highlight reel, but matters enormously to a working musician later on. The pivot to rock, and specifically to bass, happened almost by accident. As a young teenager, Anthony wanted to stand apart from the crowd of friends who were all gravitating toward guitar and drums, so he leaned toward bass instead. A friend loaned him a guitar that he reworked into something closer to a bass by stripping off 2 of the strings, and that improvised instrument became his introduction to the low end. His father, seeing genuine commitment rather than a passing phase, eventually bought him a proper bass and an amplifier, which gave him real tools to develop on. Anthony has cited bassists like Jack Bruce and John Paul Jones as formative influences during this period, players known for serving the song rather than showboating, a philosophy that would define his own playing style for the rest of his career. Notably, Anthony is left-handed, but trained himself to play right-handed, which meant every technical habit he built had to be earned through deliberate practice rather than natural instinct. By the early 1970s, Anthony was playing in local Southern California bands, eventually landing in a group called Snake that worked the same regional club circuit as another young band, one fronted by 2 brothers named Alex and Eddie Van Halen, then performing under the name Mammoth. The 2 acts crossed paths at shows around Pasadena and Arcadia. An encounter that's often credited with putting Anthony on the Van Halen brothers' radar happened when Mammoth sound equipment failed during a gig and Anthony offered up his own band's gear so the show could continue. It was a small, generous gesture, but it left an impression. When Mammoth's bassist Mark Stone left the group not long after, Eddie and Alex remembered Anthony and invited him to a jam session, reportedly in a garage, to see if there was real chemistry. There was. His bass playing locked in tightly with Alex's drumming, and his vocal range gave the group a harmony option they hadn't had before. He was in. Around the same period, the band changed its name from Mammoth to Van Halen, largely because another act was already performing under the Mammoth name and a change was necessary. With David Lee Roth on vocals, Eddie on guitar, Alex on drums, and Anthony on bass, the classic lineup was locked into place, and what followed over the next several years was a rapid climb through the Los Angeles club scene, playing venues like the Whiskey, A Go-Go, and Gazzarri's before landing a deal with Warner Brothers. When the band's self-titled debut dropped in 1978, Anthony's fingerprints were all over it, steady, driving bass on tracks like Runnin' with the Devil, and high, piercing backing vocals that became instantly recognizable as part of the Van Halen sound, distinct from Roth's showmanship and Eddie's guitar pyrotechnics, but just as essential to the overall chemistry. In those early years, Anthony wasn't treated as a hired hand. According to the band's former manager Noel Monk, all 4 members split profits and expenses equally, meaning Anthony carried an equal financial stake in the band's business, roughly a quarter of both the debts and the earnings, and had a genuine voice in decisions. That equal footing held for a while as the band toured relentlessly and built a reputation as one of hard rock's most explosive live acts, moving through Fair Warning and Diver Down with a rhythm section that critics and fans increasingly recognized as the backbone of the group's sound, even if Eddie's guitar work got most of the attention. That equal footing didn't survive the band's biggest commercial peak. By 1984, Van Halen had reached a new level of success with the album of the same name, driven by massive singles like Jump and Panama. But according to Monk, that same period is when Anthony's financial and legal standing inside the band quietly collapsed. In his memoir about his years managing the group, Monk described a moment backstage, hours before a show, when Anthony was presented with a new contract by his three bandmates and pressured to sign it on the spot. The agreement reportedly stripped him of future songwriting credit and retroactively cut him out of royalties tied to material he had already helped create, including songs on the 1984 album itself. Monk has said he would have advised against signing it had he known about it in time. Anthony went ahead anyway, reportedly because he didn't want to create conflict or put the tour at risk. It's the kind of decision that looks small in the moment and enormous in hindsight. Over the following decades, as 1984 alone sold more than 10 million copies in the United States, Anthony's absence from the songwriting credits meant he never saw the royalties that success should have generated for him. He kept playing, kept touring, kept singing those harmonies live every night. But on paper, he had gone from an equal partner to a salaried performer in the band he helped build from a garage jam session. For years, Anthony said almost nothing about it publicly. He continued showing up, continued being the reliable one amid a band known for internal chaos, and let the contract sit as a private wound rather than a public grievance. It wasn't until later interviews and fan Q&As, well after the fact, that he confirmed the pressure he'd been under and acknowledged that he'd essentially been cornered into the deal. Even then, his tone stayed measured. He said repeatedly that keeping the band together mattered more to him than the money, which is either a remarkably generous read on the situation or a quiet acknowledgement that he never really had the leverage to fight back. The financial erosion was one thing. The public erosion of his reputation as a musician was another, and it stung in a different way. In a 2015 interview with Billboard, Eddie Van Halen made comments that suggested Anthony lacked initiative as a bassist, going so far as to claim he'd had to walk Anthony through parts note by note. The remarks landed hard, not just with fans, but with musicians who had watched Anthony hold together some of the most technically demanding rhythm sections in rock for close to 3 decades. Anthony pushed back directly, saying in later interviews that he had always worked out the band's material on his own, that no such teaching sessions ever took place, and that if they had, there would be some record of it. There wasn't. To a lot of longtime fans, the claim read less like a factual account and more like an attempt to rewrite Anthony's contribution out of the band's history after the fact. What made it worse for Anthony wasn't just the public embarrassment, it was who it came from. This was a person he'd known and worked alongside for decades, someone he considered not just a bandmate, but a close collaborator, and the comments cut into that relationship in a way that never fully healed. Anthony has described the experience as emotionally exhausting, particularly because his instinct throughout his time in the band had always been to smooth things over rather than escalate them. He didn't fire back publicly with the same intensity, but he has acknowledged that the growing distance between himself and Eddie, fueled by moments like this, contributed to a communication breakdown that by the mid-2000s had become almost total. That breakdown coincided with a slow, steady reduction in his actual role within the band. By the time Van Halen recorded their 1998 album with Gary Cherone on vocals, Anthony played bass on only a handful of the album's tracks, with Eddie handling bass duties on most of the rest, a quiet but telling shift in how the band's internal hierarchy was operating. When the band released a career-spanning compilation in 2004 that included a few newly recorded tracks, Anthony's involvement was limited to backing vocals. He didn't play bass on the new material at all. Each of these moments on their own could be explained away as a creative choice or a scheduling issue. But taken together, they painted a picture of a founding member being steadily edged out of the band's actual output, while still being kept around for touring and promotional appearances. That contradiction came to a head during the 2004 reunion tour with Sammy Hagar back on vocals. According to Hagar's own account, Anthony had to agree to a reduced financial arrangement and a contract that treated him more like a hired musician than an original band member just to be part of the tour. The tour itself was commercially successful, but it didn't repair anything underneath the surface. Anthony has said he tried to stay professional and focus on the music rather than the politics. But he's also acknowledged that the signs were mounting that the band's leadership no longer viewed him as part of its long-term plans, even as they continued to rely on him on stage. The clearest confirmation of that came in 2006, when Eddie Van Halen decided to bring his teenage son, Wolfgang, into the band as the new bassist, effectively replacing Anthony. What made this especially painful for Anthony wasn't just the decision itself, it was how he found out. There was no direct call, no sit-down conversation with a man he'd shared a stage with for close to 30 years. Instead, he learned about it the way outsiders did, through news reports and fan speculation circulating online. In later interviews, Anthony has been candid about how much that stung, describing the feeling of being blindsided after decades of loyalty and contribution, with not even a courtesy call to explain the decision. For a founding member who had helped build the band from its earliest garage rehearsals, being informed of his own removal secondhand felt less like a business decision and more like an erasure, a quiet closing of a door he never got the chance to walk through on his own terms. Losing his spot in Van Halen didn't end Anthony's career, and in some ways it opened up a more creatively satisfying chapter. He reconnected with Sammy Hagar, and the two built a genuine partnership outside the shadow of the Van Halen name. In 2005, they launched a touring act called The Other Half, built around performing Van Halen material from both the Roth and Hagar eras, giving fans a chance to hear those songs performed live by the people who'd actually recorded them, even without the Van Halen brothers involved. A few years earlier, in 2002, Anthony and Hagar had also briefly assembled a supergroup called Planet Us alongside guitarist Joe Satriani and drummer Dean Castronovo, with Journey's Neil Schon joining at points. The project never released a full album, but a couple of its recorded tracks eventually surfaced on one of Hagar's solo releases, and the collaboration reinforced Anthony's standing among top-tier musicians well outside the Van Halen ecosystem. The most successful of these post-Van Halen ventures turned out to be Chickenfoot, formed in 2008 with Hagar, Satriani, and Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Chad Smith. Their self-titled debut in 2009 cracked the top 10 on the Billboard 200 and earned strong reviews, proving that Anthony's playing and vocal harmonies were just as effective in a new context as they'd been in Van Halen. A follow-up album in 2011 backed that up further, and by 2014, Anthony had joined Hagar again in a new project called The Circle, rounded out by guitarist Vic Johnson and Jason Bonham, son of Led Zeppelin John Bonham, on drums. The Circle leaned into a mix of Van Halen, Led Zeppelin, and Hagar's own back catalog in its live shows, while also releasing original material, including an album that reached the top 5 on the Billboard 200 in 2019. None of it replaced what he'd lost with Van Halen, but it made clear that his exit from the band wasn't the end of his relevance as a musician. Eddie Van Halen's death in 2020 reopened old wounds and, briefly, seemed like it might offer some kind of resolution. In the years that followed, there was real interest, reportedly including from within the band's own circle, in organizing some kind of tribute or reunion tour to honor Eddie's legacy. Alex Van Halen was said to have reached out to former collaborators, including Anthony and Roth, and Joe Satriani was floated as a possible guitarist for the project, with Anthony's involvement seen as essential to giving any such tour real credibility. But the plan fell apart before it ever became concrete. Reports pointed to resistance from Roth, who reportedly didn't want to participate in a show built explicitly around honoring Eddie in the way the rest of the group envisioned, and Alex's own health issues, including a reported back injury, made a physically demanding tour increasingly unlikely. Anthony has confirmed he was contacted and was open to being part of it, but the combination of interpersonal tension and practical obstacles proved too much to overcome. For Anthony, It meant losing what might have been his last realistic chance at some kind of closure with the band and its history, a door that opened briefly after Eddie's death and then quietly shut again. Complicating any future retrospective project even further is the stance taken by Valerie Bertinelli, Eddie's ex-wife and the mother of Wolfgang Van Halen. In interviews, she's been blunt about her opposition to any kind of biopic covering Eddie's life or Van Halen's history, going so far as to say she told her son to make sure she's no longer alive before anything like that gets made. Her reasoning centers on protecting the reality of who Eddie was from being flattened or sensationalized for entertainment, particularly the more painful chapters involving his struggles with addiction. Having been married to him for over 2 decades and having witnessed those struggles up close, she's made clear that watching a dramatized version of that pain play out on screen isn't something she's willing to sit through, joking that she'd only consider it tolerable if someone like Selena Gomez played her, before immediately adding that she hoped it would never actually happen. That protective instinct extends to Wolfgang as well, who has spoken openly about the pressure of being Eddie's son in the public eye, and who has pushed back against people he feels exploit his father's legacy for their own gain. Rather than chasing a splashy reunion or leaning into nostalgia, Wolfgang has focused his own career on Mammoth WVH, a project where he writes, records, and performs virtually everything himself, a deliberate choice to build something on his own terms rather than simply inherit his father's shadow. He's also confirmed there's a substantial archive of unreleased Van Halen recordings, and guitarist Steve Lukather, a longtime friend of Eddie's, has said he and Alex have been going through some of that material, though any decision about releasing it would require careful handling and the family's approval. Wolfgang has been clear that there are no concrete plans for a new album or tour under the Van Halen name, stating plainly that the band can't exist without his father, a position that reflects both grief and a genuine reluctance to turn Eddie's legacy into a commercial product. For Michael Anthony, turning 70 has meant looking back on all of this with a clarity that comes easier with distance. He's talked in recent years about the contract he was pressured into signing, about Eddie's public dismissal of his contributions, about learning secondhand that his own job in the band had been given to someone else. None of it has come out as bitterness exactly, more as a quiet insistence on setting the record straight after decades of staying professional and letting other people control the narrative. He's never denied that Van Halen made him who he is as a musician, but he's also stopped pretending that his exit from the band was clean or fair. What he's built since then, with Hagar and Chickenfoot and The Circle, has given him a body of work that stands on its own, separate from the band that once tried to write him out of its own story. And at 70, having watched the reunion he hoped for fall apart and the door to real closure close once more, Michael Anthony seems less interested in being remembered as the quiet bassist who never complained, and more interested in making sure people understand exactly what he gave to a band that, for a long time, gave less back than it should have.